Hey guys, my name is Haley and today we're going to be filming the first book that I read by an author for a bunch of my favorite authors and then my favorite book by that author. I don't really know how to title this. I'm gonna have to look up other people's videos and see what they wrote as the title, but I really like the concept, so we're gonna get right on into it. The first of those is, for the majority of these, I really tried to not pick authors that I've only read like one series from. And I have one exception for that, and that is because the series I have read from this author and the fact that he has become my favorite author is 30 plus books long. So I feel like it is different from other authors that are also my favorites. So like Piper CJ, obviously favorite author, but I've only read one series, so I didn't include her in this. But the first one I'm going to talk about is Criminal Intentions by Cole McCade. I have not had the chance to talk about this very many times because I read all of them like in the last year or two, and they were my obsession. I read nothing but this for months, and it was my favorite book of the year that I started this series, which was the year before last, I believe, when I wasn't making YouTube videos, so I never got the chance to talk about it. But this is a 31 book, I believe there's 31 out right now and it's not finished yet, series about two male detectives. It very much takes place in the cop scene, which is not something that I ever personally enjoy reading about, but it is them working together on cases, solving cases. I like to describe it as more gay Sherlock. I call it my gay cop drama is how I refer to it to a lot of other people when I'm recommending it. It is these two just getting to know each other. There is fantastic ace rep in this from one of the characters. One of the characters is Korean American, the other one is Jewish, and it is just a clash of all these cultures, but also does a lot of really good commentary on the police force, which I truly appreciate that is addressed so well in this series as someone who has an issue with the way that things are, at least in America, with our cops. So I cannot recommend this enough. I'm hoping to do a series on me rereading this series and annotating it and doing like video chats about it, because it truly is one of my favorite things I've come across in years. But the first book of this I read of the series is called The Cardigans, and then my personal favorite is, I believe, the sixth one, which is When There's Smoke, because that is when a lot of the romance starts to really blossom. So that's how we're starting off this video. The other ones are not so much one specific series, so don't worry about that. Next up, a favorite author of mine is Sierra Simone. I have read 2 of her series, and I own another one of them. But the first book of hers that I read was Priest. I read this, I want to say 2 years ago, maybe last year. I don't really remember. It was one of my favorite books of the year when I did read it. And this is just exactly what it sounds like. It is a smutty priest romance. It is about a priest who realizes that he is being tempted by a woman, and it makes him question his whole life choices. This is very, very angsty. A lot of Sierra Simone is very angsty with a lot of like religious trauma involved in it. So this is the first book of hers that I read. Then for reference, I have also read her American Queen, American Prince, all of that series. But my favorite of hers books that I've read is Sinner, which is the second book in the Priest series, and this is the story about a woman who is going to become a nun, and then before she takes her vows, she decides that she wants to experience sex and a sexual relationship, considering she's not going to be able to do it for the rest of her life, and it is their romance with her and this guy. And this cover is beautiful. I love the old covers. I'm so glad that I bought them before they went out of print, but highly, highly recommend this series. Highly recommend Sierra Simone if you want some like angsty smut. Like that is 100% what I would consider all of her books. Next up, a favorite author of mine that I can't remember if I talked about her as much on my channel. I'm trying to remember when I ended, like, not ended, but the last time I was active on my channel and what books I was talking about, but I'm not gonna worry about that right now. But the first book of Sarah Cates that I read was Praise. This is the first book in her Salacious Players Club. I've read most of those. I have started to read some of her other books, And this is another situation where, like, these I all consider pretty much standalones, like interconnected standalones, but standalones all the same. You could pick up any book in the series and understand what's going on. But the first book of hers I read was Praise. This is the age gap romance. Really, really enjoyed this one, but my favorite of hers, which I feel is an unpopular opinion, my favorite of the series is Eyes on Me. This is a stepbrother romance. I've learned that I generally tend to really like stepbrother, especially if it's their parents got married when they were older, so they really didn't grow up together at all. I prefer that in the stepbrother romance, but this book in particular is very special to me because there are a lot of themes in this that helped me deconstruct, not that it involves religion at all, but helped me deconstruct a lot of the beliefs that I had coming out of the church. And it is a book that I share a lot of things with my partner, because when we first got together, I annotated another copy of this book and gave it to him, and he would like read it passages and read through my annotations over FaceTime. So this book is very special to me for that reason. And I love Mia in this. Mia is one of my favorite like female characters of all time. I have like the art print, which I'm not a big art print person at all when it comes to bookish stuff, but I love this book. I have a feeling it will always be my favorite Sarah Kate book, but this is definitely my favorite of hers. Next up we have Laura Kay. This is a like spicy romance club type series author that I've really, really enjoyed everything I've read by. I think I've read like 2 or 3 of her series, and she mostly writes novellas, at least of the ones that I've read. And the first book of hers that I read was Hearts in Darkness. This is 2 people who get stuck in an elevator and fall in love in the hours that they are stuck in the darkness and get to know each other and like have very serious conversations. And then my favorite book of hers is actually the sequel to that book, and that is Love in the Light. This novella made me cry my eyeballs out. It is set around the holidays, specifically Thanksgiving, and something about this just really got to me, and it is probably my favorite of hers that I read. I own a bunch of her other novellas of like the Spicy Club ones, like Bound to Submit. What are the other ones? Mastering Her Senses, There's to Take, all of those. I own a bunch of her books, but this is probably my favorite. And I do actually want to get back into reading a lot more of her books because I think she has a whole nother series that I have not read yet. Next up is Rebecca Weatherspoon. She is an author that I also really want to get back into, and I read like almost all of her books at once that she had out at the time when I first got into her, but the first one I read was Seni, however we're pronouncing it. My brain automatically wants to pronounce it the Chinese way with an X, but I think it's Zeni. But this is one of the first books that helped me discover things about myself that I like when there is a dominant woman. That is a big part of this. There's also a lot of switching happening in here, which is another thing that helped me realize things about myself. It was one of the first romance books that I read coming out of the church, so a lot of these are like very formative in me learning more about myself out of that controlling religious space, and I highly recommend this. This is also my favorite book by Rebecca Weatherspoon. I've read her Beers and Bondage series as well, and I started to read some of her, I think she has like a vampire one, like a paranormal one. I started to read that series. So Seni is definitely my favorite of her books, and to my knowledge probably always will be, just because of how much it means to me and things I learned about myself along the way. Next up is a favorite of mine that has been a favorite of mine for a very, very, very long time, and that is Laini Taylor. The first book of hers that I read was Daughter of Smoke and Bone. This was my favorite series for the longest time. If you go back to my old videos, I'm pretty sure I talk about this all the time. I've been really wanting to do a reread of it since getting back into fantasy, because I only read romance really for like 2 years after leaving my high control religion. But this is a series about a girl, and she discovers this other world. I really don't like to give spoilers on this because I think it is done well if you just know nothing going in. And it's just, she has a guardian who collects teeth, and it involves angels is the only other thing that I usually say about it. But I've been really wanting to read the series, and if I do, maybe I'll annotate it. That could be a fun series as well, of me getting back into fantasy series that I used to really know and love as someone who is coming out of reading a lot of romance. Get back to my roots, and then also get more into a lot of romantasy, which is the thing I've been trying to do over the last year or two. But I think my favorite book by Laini Taylor is Strange the Dreamer. This, as you can see, is super annotated. I love this book. And I am also curious now as a romance reader, because back when I used to read fantasy, I was not at all. This is a very heavy romance fantasy novel, which I'm way more interested now. As someone, I used to get really annoyed with reading romance in books, but as someone who read exclusively romance books for like 2 or 3 years and is now getting into romantasy, I feel like I would appreciate the sequel to this a lot more now than I did when it came out, because I remember not really liking it. But Strange the Dreamer is 100% my favorite by Laini Taylor, and I am hoping to do a reread of this soon to see if my thoughts on it change. That's another reason I want to reread a lot of my fantasy books that I used to love, for the fact that a lot of them were like pioneers of romantasy, and I didn't realize that's what it was at a time, because I didn't know romantasy was going to be such a big thing in society as it is now. Next up, favorite author of mine is Harley LaRue. First book of hers that I read was Her Soul to Take. Oh, you know what? No, it's not. The first book of hers that I read was, I think, The Dare. I don't remember if I read Her Soul to Take or The Dare first. It was one of these two. It was a really long time ago. But my favorite of hers is Her Soul to Take. I have also read her Loser's Duology, which are the subsequent full books from the novella The Dare. But this really got me on my paranormal kick that I was on several years ago, that I still have, and I go through a lot of phases of just wanting to read exclusively paranormal stuff. But this is a book about a girl who like goes to do a summoning. It actually works. She's surprised, and it's her romance with the demon that she summons. I love this series. I love Harley LaRue, and her books were some of the first ones I saw have truly like an extensive list of trigger warnings, which is something that I realized that I desperately needed back when I was trying to get into paranormal or dark romance, and it wasn't as common then as it is now. And it wasn't until I read some books that didn't have the trigger warning list that I ended up accidentally coming across triggers that I didn't know I had that really upset me. So I truly appreciate her for her pioneering, at least from my experience, in trigger warnings, an extensive trigger warnings list, so that people don't come across something that could be potentially damaging to their mental health and like not allow them to enjoy reading. So my favorite of hers, definitely Her Soul to Take. I don't remember. This is a case of, I think I might have read The Dare and this at about the same time, so still my favorite. Next up is a newer favorite author of mine, and that is Ali Hazelwood. If you don't know, I went through a phase of reading all of her books in the span of like 3 weeks, about a month and a half ago. And the first book of hers that I read was The Love Hypothesis, which quite honestly, this is still one of my favorites of her. It's probably my second favorite, but my favorite after having read all of her books. Bear in mind, I have not read Not in Love. But my favorite of hers is actually Check and Mate, which is supposedly YA. I don't think it's YA at all. I think if anything, it's new adult, and it doesn't read any different from any of her adult books. So this is actually my favorite. It surprised me because I thought I wouldn't like it because it was marketed as young adult, but I loved this book. I loved the couple dynamic, and I think more people should read it, because I think a lot of people didn't read it because they were told it was young adult, and it definitely is not. And then we have an old favorite author of mine. This is actually an author where my views on the video I made for him years ago still gets so many views, and I think it's because he blew up over the last couple of years. I think after his books started getting adapted, and that is John Marrs. The first book of his that I read was The Passengers. I really enjoyed his books. I read all, but I think his newest one, and The Passengers, was like his really popular one back in the day, that one and The One. So I did like a whole guide to John Marrs. I'll leave that linked down in the comments below if you haven't seen it yet, because that one still gets quite a lot of views for my small little channel. But my favorite of his is actually What Lies Between Us, which is this very closed door, like there's a woman locked in the attic, another woman lives in the house, and we don't know what the dynamic is between them. And I had a vlog where I was reading this book and filmed like my reaction to the end of it, and it is still one of my favorite John Marrs books to date. And then last that I have for now, when I read a lot more of my newest favorite authors' books, I will probably do an updated version of this video. But for now, one of my favorite authors that I have left that I have not talked about yet is Alice Oseman. Everyone and their mother has read Heartstopper. Heartstopper is like my second favorite of her books. But the first book of hers that I read was actually I Was Born for This. I read this years ago. This is the one that I feel like I would have to reread of her books because I read it even years before I binge read the rest of her books. And this is literally about two friends going to see a boy band. And I read it with a friend of mine, and it was just a very formative experience for me seeing a fangirl put into a book. As someone who was really into K-pop, this gives very much K-pop fan vibes. And I really enjoyed this. This is not one I remember a whole lot about. But my favorite of hers is one that was also, again, returning topic in this video. A very formative one for me learning a lot more about myself, and that is Loveless. This book helped me realize that as a teenager especially, I was on the ace spectrum, and I still am. I now identify more as demisexual than ace, but it is still on the ace spectrum, and this was really like one of the first books that made me realize that I probably was somewhere on the queer spectrum, not realizing that, having been somebody who had come out of a really high control, like, culty religion where comp het is just very normal, and I didn't even think about my sexuality or the fact that I might also be attracted to other people, or that I wasn't attracted to people as a teenager, because I was very much the teenager that didn't care about dating very much, other than, like, I knew I was supposed to do it because that's what you saw in all the movies, but I didn't care nearly as much about, like, dating and sex as other people my age. And this book made me realize that I probably was somewhere on that spectrum. Because even though this character in particular is on the Aro Ace end of the spectrum, I had never even heard, I don't think, of the word demisexual until I read this book. And it was really, really big, eye-opening thing. So much that I did end up, this was one of the first special editions of any book that I ever bought. So I have these two pretty editions of them, but this book was very, very, very special to me and will probably always be my favorite of her books for that reason alone. And I'm grateful that a book like this exists for people who are, even though it is YA, for people who are just learning about their own sexuality and more about themselves, that this book reminds people that this is a very, very valid experience to have, and it doesn't make you any less just because you're not interested or as interested in romantic love as other people. Or even sexual love. That was a big one for, like, people did not understand about me as a teenager, is I just did not care about sex. Like, I genuinely could not have cared less. Like, I liked the idea of, like, romance and dating, but not the sex part of it, and I didn't partake in any of that until my early 20s. And I do think that's becoming more normalized as a lot of more queer identities are understood by the younger generations. But this is a book that I wish that, like, people that are older than me had growing up, to be able to realize that this is a very valid thing to feel, and that you're not weird or strange or different in a bad way just because you aren't interested in romance or sex. And I think this paints this in a very, very hopeful light. But yes, these are some of the first and then favorite books by some of my favorite authors. I'm like out of frame. Thank you all for watching, and I will see all of you guys next time.